If you've seen the news at all, turned it on in the last couple days, you've probably seen the news about NAFTA, right? Anybody? No? A little bit? Poquito? En español? Don't count on my Spanish, that's muy malo. But what I wanted to do is give you all an update, because for most of us, it's been a big point of insecurity, a point of contention. And I had a lot of the brokers that I've talked to ask me, hey Rick, now that NAFTA has been signed or passed or agreed upon, what does it mean? What's it going to mean for us? So I want to give you a quick rundown of basically what happened and where we're going to go from here. So to start with just a little bit of a rundown, a reminder, NAFTA, of course, as everybody knows, was signed about 25 years ago. So it went into law on January 1st, 1994. And at that time, it was signed by Carlos Salinas here in Mexico, by Bill Clinton in the US. Anybody remember that guy? He was almost as entertaining as our current president. A little less trouble with him. And then up in Canada, Brian Mulroney. In that time, the objective was for the agreement to support millions of jobs in trade and also raise the standard of living. And that was the intention of the signers. What they wanted to do at that time was to enhance the competitiveness of North America in this suddenly global economy. As you know, back then, people really didn't talk about the global economy. It was a new idea, and the internet, if you think back to 1994, the internet wasn't really a thing. You maybe, if you were really a geek like I am, you could use dial-up and get on America Online, and that was the internet, what we had. So very, very different landscape. As much as President Trump has tried to knock down NAFTA, NAFTA had some really great benefits, and we definitely didn't want to see it fall apart. In the time that NAFTA was in place, the trade value among our three countries went from $297 billion to $1.4 trillion. NAFTA represents more than 25% of the GDP of the entire world, so it's an incredibly robust mechanism for our economies. The trade that the U.S. has with Canada and Mexico supports nearly 14 million jobs. 5 million of those alone are supported just in the increased trade. So I know that President Trump likes to talk about how NAFTA stole jobs, but actually the jobs just changed sectors. In the manufacturing world, there were a lot of job losses, but 90% of those job losses weren't from jobs being shipped here to Mexico, they were from automation. In other words, if NAFTA had never existed, the jobs still would have been lost. NAFTA was a big bonanza in the US for farmers and ranchers because it gave the US new markets for agricultural exports. US exports to Canada tripled in the agricultural sector, and they quadrupled to Mexico. So obviously it was actually very beneficial to the US. 1 in every 10 acres of American farmland is used to feed either Canada or Mexico. So it really is a very integral part of the way our economies work together. And NAFTA succeeded in creating the world's largest free trade zone covering 450 million people. Residents in the North American Free Trade region produce more than $19 trillion of goods. So if instead of looking at Mexico and the US and Canada as three separate entities, what NAFTA did is finally bind us together in a common brotherhood as one economic and one socially bound group. And of course, here in our area, we see that every day because we're part of the San Diego Baja mega region. So as you know, living down here, like I'm a gringo working in a Mexican company, and of course people go the opposite way. And our two cities are very much intertwined. In fact, just last week our mayors met and looked at ways they could increase the cooperation. So I think we're a really good model for what things should be. The biggest benefit, of course, for NAFTA was that it lowered prices for consumers. And that's one thing that it's very easy to forget. Anecdotally, one of the ones that you may not think of so much down here, but that we saw in the US was that before NAFTA was signed, avocados were a treat. They were a rarity to get up in the U.S. because the only place they were grown was California. California had a limited growing season. And of course now in the U.S. everybody can have a California burrito, which is a good Mexican burrito, but then you add French fries and avocado, making it Californian. And places like Chipotle offer guacamole or avocado standard on their menu. This was stuff that it's crazy to think of, but this just didn't exist in the U.S. So that's one of my favorites. I get to enjoy avocados all year round now because of NAFTA. In addition to that, of course, there were savings on other types of food, automotive, clothing, electronics. One of the big ones that isn't talked about is it reduced the U.S. dependence on foreign oil, especially from Venezuela. So there were a lot of very positive effects. Trump talks a lot about security, a lot of national security issues that were helped by that. Mexico buys primarily from its two trading partners, from the U.S. and Canada, and 30% of the U.S. exports go to NAFTA companies. And one interesting one is that Canada and the U.S. buy more goods from Mexico than from Japan, Germany, and Spain combined. So that's, of course, another win for Mexico. And finally, NAFTA increases trade in the region. Mexican exports to the other North American countries increased by 597% with NAFTA. So all of that to say, NAFTA has been fantastic. Not to argue that there weren't a few things to be updated. So we've talked about NAFTA being good. Everyone, I think, pretty much is on board with NAFTA being good, right? More or less? Still with me? Okay. So yeah, NAFTA had some pretty good things. Let's talk about what got updated. So the first one is the name. Now, as a marketing guy, if I had been on this naming committee, I probably would have gone a different route. The agreement is now called USMCA, or I guess we can pronounce that USMCA. Although Trump, in his recent speech, said that the name, quote, has a good ring to it. So I guess he likes USMCA. A few of the bullet points: it no longer covers water or energy. That was a really big issue for Canada because they felt like NAFTA could give the U.S. more control over their natural resources than they had on their own. It covers online shopping. That's obviously one of the things that needed to be updated. Online shopping didn't exist in 1993. One of the quotes that I love about it was, the best outcome for a trade agreement is when everybody walks away a little bit angry. And that's where we're at right now. Everybody's a little bit annoyed about some things, but that means nobody was the clear winner. It was beneficial for everybody. Basically, our North American neighborhood is better for it. One of the biggest issues for Canada was something called Chapter 19, which basically was independent review in case there's a dispute, and that stayed in there. Canada was worried that someone like Trump could come in and be a bully, and there would be no objective third party to go to. So that stays in it, and Canadians and Americans, which were the last parties to sign off on this Sunday night, said in a quote, the agreement will strengthen the middle class and create good, well-paying jobs and new opportunities for the nearly 500 million people who call North America home. The main stakeholders, of course, that are going to mostly be affected will be the domestic and foreign automakers, agriculture, dairy farmers, drug makers, manufacturers, and steel producers. Justin Trudeau said yesterday, it's a good day for Canada. And the Mexican negotiators said, to us, the agreement looks to be very good for Mexico. The culmination of this negotiation process promotes certainty in the financial markets and investment and job creation in our country. Now, this is one where I step back, because this is what affects me the most, and probably you guys. Over the first 2 quarters here in Tijuana, we had a very hard time. The lease rates in the area dropped by 80% over last year. And that was because of the uncertainty. We had a couple events going on down here. We had an election, right? And we had the NAFTA stuff. And it made any companies looking to move in here, whether they're from the US or from other markets abroad, say, let's wait until we see where things are going. As soon as the Mexican election was over, my phone started ringing a little bit more. I started getting some emails. And then as soon as Mexico and the US came to an agreement several weeks ago, all of a sudden someone turned the faucet on. And we're getting a lot more business inquiries, which is great for the local economy. And then since Monday, I'm expecting it's going to be full flow now, because we can now let people know everything's stable again. We have an optimistic future. We don't have to worry about who's in power or what's going to happen. So the main structure of the deal is basically going to change. It's basically old NAFTA with a new name. The biggest changes are going to involve automakers. So if you're not in auto, this isn't really going to apply to you. The biggest one is the rules of origin sourcing. So right now, 60 to 63% of a car that is imported into North America has to be sourced from North America, otherwise it faces tariffs. And that made a lot of sense in 1994 when cars had a steering wheel and a brake, right? But now what do cars have? They've got Bluetooth and Wi-Fi and backup cameras and all these electronics. And where does that stuff come from? Asia, right? Mostly Asia. So it was starting to tilt the balance, not just out of the US's favor, but out of Mexico and Canada's favor. So the new rule of origin says 75% of the goods in a car, for it to come in without tariff, has to be sourced from here in North America. What that's going to mean is an increase in manufacturing jobs in electronics, which again is fantastic for Mexico, fantastic for the US, fantastic for Canada. On top of that, the other one that we've talked about is the $16 minimum wage. So 40% of all cars under this agreement need to be built in a plant that pays its workers a $16 minimum wage. This is great for Mexico because it means it's going to raise the standard of living for thousands and thousands of workers and put them into good, high-paying jobs. So it will be really, really good for Mexico. There's some stuff that has to do with the Canadian dairy market, doesn't really apply here. The really big one, though, is the sunset clause. I don't know if you guys remember, Trump wanted to renegotiate the deal so that NAFTA would expire, I think it was every 4 years. And from a business side, that's crazy, right? We can't plan our production lines knowing that things could change every 4 years. So the new system is going to work like this. There's a review clause every 6 years, which coincidentally is the length of a Mexican president's term. I'm not sure that's an accident, but it means a lot less volatility. And even after that 6-year review period, let's say the 2 or 3 of the countries can't come to an agreement, there's a 10-year phase-out clause. So even 6 years from now, if the countries come together and say, it's not working, we want to rip it up, it still gives the business market 10 years of stability. If they like it or they need to tweak anything, they tweak it and then they just review it in another 6 years. So very, very good, much more stable agreement, but it allows it to be updated a little bit more. There's also some good intellectual property protections. That's mostly for pharmaceuticals. So we shouldn't really expect any dramatic economic effects except for the upside. Should give a lot better stability, which should lead to better business investment down here. The Canadian Prime Minister, or not the Prime Minister, the Minister of Foreign Affairs said it will result in freer markets, fairer trade, and robust economic growth in our region. And she literally, I heard, did an end zone, putting her hands up when she found out that it passed. So Canadian and Mexican manufacturers are guaranteed more access to American markets, especially for cars and light trucks. And less parts will be sourced from Asia. There's also a special clause that grants exemptions of 2.6 million cars per year. So even if, let's say the president of the US wanted to claim that there's a security reason he has to put tariffs on something, just fictional example, the first 2.6 million cars imported into the US still are guaranteed to come in without any restrictions. So very, very good protections for everybody. Finally, let's talk about the future really quickly. What's going on next? So I just alluded kind of tongue-in-cheek to something going on, and that's the Canada security tariffs Trump imposed on steel, citing that it was a national security threat to the US. Haven't had any word on that. We don't know when or if that's going to change. So that's still on the table, but it doesn't affect Mexico. As far as the next steps, the deal has not been signed. So right now it's an agreement. It's not an actual treaty. What will happen is it's going to be sent to the US and Mexican Congresses right now, and the US Congress needs to get it done and voted on They're hoping sometime by mid-November, and then it gets passed to President Trump to be signed. And of course, it's his idea, so he'll probably sign it. I've been told down here the negotiators want to get it done while Nieto is still in power. So I think from what I've been told, that's basically Nieto going to the Congress and saying, give this to me so I can sign it. So that seems pretty secure too. On the Canadian side, it's even easier. Trudeau doesn't have to ask anyone. He just signs it. So he has a little bit more leeway with the pen. For the future, the reason this is going to be so important is that global trade is getting very competitive. If you have paid attention at all to foreign markets, you probably have heard something called Made in China 2025. This is something we as Americans, and we are all Americans here. We all live in America. It's not just people from the US. For us as Americans, we need to pay attention to this because China has basically put out its blueprint publicly saying by 2025, we plan on taking over the world as far as trade goes. And right now, we in North America have been squabbling among each other when we should be coming together as a team and figuring out our playbook. So this is going to give us a lot more power in the global trade dynamic. A very important author, a guy named Parag Khanna, wrote a whole book on this called Connectography. And he said, the new arms race is to connect to the most markets, a race China is now winning, having launched a wave of infrastructure investments to unite Eurasia around its new Silk Roads. The United States can only gain ground by fusing with its neighbors into a supercontinental North American Union of shared resources and prosperity. And I think that's spot on. We all need to come together as neighbors and stay competitive. The WTO, the IMF, and the World Bank released a joint statement saying opening markets is a key to raising living standards. They approved of the new and updated trade agreement so the trade rules could be updated to reflect new advancements. And finally, the Foundation for Economic Education said, we should wish for our society and those of our allies to enjoy thriving economies that achieve maximum productivity and employment. Reducing trade barriers and granting greater access to markets across the board facilitates this goal. A robust trade agreement helps solidify good international relations, helping all people to live in peace and prosperity. So, in other words, a free and extensive trade, unsubsidized among nations, and Christian actually talked about this at our last event, that free trade lowers tensions and it benefits everybody. It's morally and economically the only proper policy. So to wrap up before I turn it over to Rafael Martinez, I found a great quote which I just love, and this is from an Austrian man named Ludwig von Mises. And he said, when people and goods cross borders, armies do not. I think that's key.